In a world overflowing with distractions, we seek meaning. How do we transform ambition into something deeper, into true fulfillment? I'm Sam Pepin, CEO of Coordisc, and I've spent years helping businesses succeed by connecting their goals to something bigger. On the Meaningful podcast, we explore not just how to win in business, but how to grow as individuals. Through conversation with thought leaders, innovators, and everyday heroes, we uncover the stories that drive us towards something greater. Whether you're striving for success, seeking purpose, or just looking for the next steps in your journey, this podcast is your guide to navigating the intersection of ambition, growth, and meaning. So please join me and our incredible guests as we redefine what's possible in both business and life. Enjoy. Economics is the method, the object is to change the soul. Welcome to the Meaningful Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Pepin, and today we're exploring three transformative themes: redefining economic system through game theory, the intersection of technology and ethical markets, and creating a more collaborative future in trade and commerce. Our guest today is Noah Healy, a visionary market designer and the founder of Coordisc. With a profound understanding of game theory and a passion for reshaping economic model, Noah is pioneering a collaborative approach to market systems. His work is not just about numbers and algorithmic, it's about rethinking the very fabric of how we trade, collaborate, and build sustainable futures. If you enjoyed this discussion, please let the world know with a like, small review, or even a quick share. Your support helps more people find meaningful content just like this. Let's begin. Mr. Noah Healy, welcome on the Meaningful Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me here, Sam.
Absolutely. It's fantastic to have you on, and some of the work that you're doing is truly fascinating. So I'm very glad to be able to platform you. And truly, to kick us off, tell us more about Coordisc.
So Coordisc is a company I founded around a decade ago as a vehicle for the intellectual property that I discovered and am attempting to get codified. Effectively, I've come up with a way to make financial markets vastly more efficient than they have been by exploiting our present understanding of information and communication, which are, relatively recent breakthroughs in human history. And by doing so, vastly reduce the amount of noise and error that creep into the functioning of a marketplace. So I've been working on getting that patent since 2015. There's been a wide variety of adventures, but it's become really crazy since 2020. The patent office is breaking laws and making claims that make no sense. And so just earlier this month, I filed the brief in federal court suing them over their behavior over the last 4 years. And so that particular saga is currently in progress.
and we'll dive into that saga, no doubt. One thing that inspired me from your journey, Noah, is really the intersection of mathematics and technology and how that shape basically your understanding of the world. You seem to take a lot of insights from a pioneer like Alan Turing, which I don't want to mispronounce. When you're thinking about how you draw inspiration from these great figures, tell me more about how you started to explore those passions in the first place.
As I said, I've always been fairly curious, but my specific fascination with this area of study in mathematics was kicked off by getting a job programming a computer. I had been exposed to computer programming in school at various levels, even looked into it a bit, but most scholastic pedagogy is usually has to do with having the students program either a visual design or a game. I assume that's to engage them with the process. And I had no interest in game design or special effects. I like watching Star Wars and Tron. I don't want to make Star Wars or Tron. I'm happy that there are people that do want to do that, but that wasn't really my area. So I'd sort of been shown these things, and I kind of bounced off them and didn't really care. But then, you're employed, and you should understand what you're doing, and so I started digging in. And there's an entirely new kind of philosophy that is attached to these understandings. What Alan Turing did was invent a fundamentally new kind of mathematical proof, and a fundamentally new approach to the discovery of truth. He created what I describe as the non-constructive impossibility proof. So impossibility proofs are well known. Um, Things like the infinitude of prime numbers go back to Euclid. You basically say, imagine that there's only a finite number of primes, multiply all those numbers together, add 1 to it. Which prime number divides this new number you just came up with? Well, none of the ones that you know about. There must not be the finite number of primes. So impossibility proofs have been well known, and have been used in a wide variety of things. Non-constructive proofs are a more recent vintage. The discovery that something is possible without actually doing it was highly controversial when it was sort of first discovered. And in fact, there are people who very credibly argue that books like Alice in Wonderland were written in part because Lewis Carroll, his real name was Charles Dodgson, he was in fact one of the better logicians that have ever lived. And he created what's known as symbolic logic. And he was one of the best constructionist mathematicians that ever lived, and he was effectively arguing with the non-constructionist mathematicians of his day. And there are people who believe that things like Alice in Wonderland are his critique of the ridiculousness of non-constructibility, because both Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, while they are nonsensical, they are also logically sound. And this appears probably most dramatically in the speech of Tweedledum and Tweedledee, in which they're talking about the way that logic works. But I'm unaware of a previous move to demonstrate that something's impossible without demonstrating how the specific thing that you're talking about is impossible. What Turing did was demonstrate that there was an entire class of things that couldn't be done, because if you could do them, you would also be able to do this other one specific thing that couldn't be done. And that class of things turns out to be the kind of thing that we actually consider among ourselves to be stuff that people are good at, and that are admirable things for people to be good at. Stuff like planning and management and so on are all processes that have no general solution. And Turing, over his limited lifespan, was aware and promoted the fact that our very constructionist views that had come out of the Enlightenment had these enormous gaping holes that we really hadn't noticed, because these holes are actually in our imaginations. That our imaginations, in fact, don't encompass everything. They only encompass everything that we can imagine. And there's this sort of great vast structure that we can't imagine. And it might be nice if we were able to do so, but we can't, because we can't imagine it, and we can only sort of very indirectly discover the existence of these holes using his non-constructive impossibility technique.
Wow. Now that's very insightful, and that's something that I always and I've been diving into your work recently, and it's very interesting how you have the ability of breaking down very complex subjects in making basically mathematics and on other very complex topics very relatable. And I think that's one of your core strength, no doubt. When you're thinking about that specific abilities and how that obviously intertwine with the functionality of your early career as not on your early career, your career periods as a conversationalist and an innovator. Can you tell me more about how you perhaps was that always the case? Were you always born with this sense of mind, logical mind that can break down complex ideas, or how did you acquire that skill?
Well, I think my secret is that I never, ever, ever do anything that's complex at all. I only do things that are simple. Um and and so the way I think about sort of hard problems is that there's difficulty and complexity. Um, so think about the difference in the physical realm between sort of picking up, 700 pounds off the floor and say painting a masterpiece. Painting a masterpiece isn't physically difficult in the sense that, hitting the gym would be necessary, but
Mm-hmm.
it's so complicated that virtually no people ever would master the fine motor skill and coordination and so on required to do it. Picking up 700 pounds off the floor is something that also not very many people can do. Uh, but at the end of the day, it's fundamentally simple. It either comes up off the floor or it doesn't. And it
Mm-hmm.
either gets, up there or it doesn't. Uh, in the mental space, I stick with those simple, difficult problems, and I shy well away from the complex problems. And my observation is that people mostly dive into complexity and are willing to trade almost any amount of complexity in order to avoid the difficult, hard things. And from what I've been able to tell historically and just in my own personal experience, that's mostly self-deception, and usually it's also deceptive to other people as well. So the complexity approach can make you think that you're doing something useful, and quite frequently, if you believe it, other people will also believe that you're doing something useful. But if you sort of look back through the history, you'll discover that mostly no, it was just totally worthless, make work that just happened to be going on, and something else, usually something difficult, is actually what was driving whatever success might have been around.
Interesting. So when you say that you stay far away from complex, difficult subjects and topics, is that by choice of basically of your understanding that they're not necessary and not practical and perhaps worthless, as you said, when you look at history most of the time, or is that because perhaps you don't think anything is complex and difficult? Tell me more about
Oh,
that
no, no, no!
relationship.
Things are complicated. Yes, there are a lot of complicated and difficult things, but again, I just think, sort of as a matter of principle, and it's certainly one of my principles, is that you're not really going to succeed with complexity, and complexity is one of those things. It turns out that systems don't have to become very complicated at all before they become subject to Turing's space of universal computability. And once something is as complicated as a universal Turing machine, which again isn't a very complicated object, uh, suddenly there are hard limits to what you're capable of doing there, and you aren't capable of understanding where those hard limits are. And so, if you want to be able to even think sort of functionally and usefully about what you're doing, you have to stay underneath that ceiling, and that ceiling is sort of a sub basement ceiling, and it's more of a crawl space. Like, you have to keep things very, very simple. But what it does mean is that you can explain what you're doing to people in colloquial English, because it's simple.
Right. I love what Leonardo da Vinci had to say on this, which is simplicity is the highest form of sophistication. It's very interesting because that's actually the first quote when you enter one of my favorite museum in Montreal, and when you're truly thinking about your own story and this early fascination basically with game theory and kind of like the practical applications of those of what you were fascinating by. I'd love if we can dive and if you can reflect perhaps and we can dive together into how that evolved into an area of expertise in the first place.
Well, so I was working on this notion of communication on networks. Network communication is something that's deeply studied. It is the core of something called information theory, which the paper on which is from, I think, 1946, Claude Shannon. And it introduces the idea of information entropy, which has become an extremely important part of our understanding of physics now. Uh, and and so we know a lot about sort of moving bits down a line, and we're utilizing this right now between the two of us. Uh, However, the social impacts of communication are something that have not been studied from that perspective.
Hmm.
There's sociological studies and political science and so on that attempts to influence and shape culture, and obviously there are artists that attempt to do things like this as well. Uh, but there's a phrase by Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, that sort of how you get information is almost as important, or in many cases, more important than the information you're getting. Uh, and we've really seen this explode in the internet age, the whole sort of second wave of the internet, social media. We've gotten these entirely new mechanisms that are in effectively everybody's hands to communicate with each other, and it doesn't look like it's working out for us as a society to have this capacity. And so one aspect of it that I was interested in was how would you get consensus information out of distributed agents across a network. So you could have people, you could have robots, you could have sensors. If I want to know what the temperature is like outside, I I have to go to particular uh, moments of truth, or walk out the door with a thermometer or something and figure that out. But how would we be able to create distributed systems that could give us this information, particularly if I didn't want to know what the temperature was like outside my house, but outside, say, your house, or some location out in the middle of the Gobi Desert where there might not be a person for hundreds of miles. Uh, so that's what I was thinking about. And when you're thinking about how agents interact, the mathematics of that, and this goes back to, I believe, the 20s, is game theory, which had a lot of its development sort of in the second half of the 20th century. And so I'm fiddling around with game theory and network communication, and this approach sort of falls out that has economic implications. And I tell my friend and at the time neighbor about it, and he asks if you can predict the stock market with it, and I say no, you can't do that. Can't pay enough. And as I'm walking back to my house, it triggers kind of an insight. Markets pay for information. That's how they work.
Hmm.
Okay, well, if a marketplace pays for information and I have this efficient mechanism to pay for information, could I sort of recursively turn this system on itself so that it would pay for information? can you solve that problem? I didn't know if I could, so I tried, and so I had some awareness of the broad structure of existing marketplaces, and I was using that as a guide. Like if a design underperforms the market along some trait or axis, then it's no good. It's got to be in the zone or better, basically, than the markets to be a good design. And so I'm kind of pulling things together, and I get this sort of rough design idea together, and then I write the code to actually do the load testing, because at the end of the day, without empirical load testing, nobody can really tell you whether or not something is a good or a bad algorithm. And this is a good algorithm. The computer I had at the time, which was not that impressive for the day, could handle roughly half the capacity of the entire global financial system. And
Wow.
this computer here could easily handle all of it.
Very interesting. When you're thinking about, because game theory has been applied to various areas of obviously of life, you seem to have very much dialed into economics and also what you described a little bit, but also daily decision making, which I think is very interesting. Can you tell us more about why you chose those specific lines in particular?
Well, again, it was all constrained by the problem I was having. So
Mm.
the to have a mathematical tool that applies to having large numbers of agents, game theory is that tool. Then, because I was searching for a way to reach consensus, uh, the subset of games known as coordination games are also known as stagnation games, because they're really, really good at producing consensuses. In fact, for most purposes, they are too good at producing consensuses, and they will sort of keep going in whatever stagnant form they are, even if there could be a better form. And so what I thought up was, what if you could add a new player to one of these evolutionarily stable stagnation games that would be a computer program that doesn't have the traits of ordinary players in the game,
Hmm.
that everybody knows has these sort of extraordinary traits. And the computer program has this power to coordinate large numbers of people to reward people providing it with guidance and inputs, and to impose costs on those who want to be among the powerful people. And so this combination essentially allows the game to become what I call a negotiation game, a system that can remain coordinated and flexible at the same time. And that's a very powerful new approach to problem solving. And if you can figure out how to solve the various problems of the underlying sort of communication space and so on, then you can build a mechanism that does this. And that's what I did.
Yeah. And one thing that was always fascinating to me is kind of like the ethics of algorithmic and this idea in which you are designing solutions with a conscience, or at least that's what I derive from seeing some of your things. When you're diving into basically the creative element of building those ethical algorithmic, tell me more about because that's very inspiring to me. But what inspired you to this commitment of using technology, responsibility, and most importantly, to benefit society? Where does that urge come from?
Sort of those principles again. Uh, if you're creating things that are as powerful as the things that we can now create and put on the internet, um, controlling them isn't really a practical matter once they have scaled up to being used by even thousands of people, let alone billions. And so you have to do all the control work up front, uh,
Mm.
so that once they get big, they don't come back and kind of smack you around. And we've seen this sort of failure across multiple attempts. There are extremely valuable code bases, things like um, 90s Windows, some of the AAA games like the Madden series, for example, that are incredibly valuable, or were incredibly valuable, but they just became so bloated and uncontrolled that either it's just impractically expensive to continue working with them, and so they're sort of grinding their costs up as a result of this, or in the case of Windows, Microsoft was ultimately forced to abandon this ridiculously valuable code base because it had become so impractical that they couldn't continue with it, uh, and and that did a lot of damage to the company's position, uh, which had been built on this unification and backwards compatibility that they were forced to break, and so most successful systems haven't done this upfront work, and we can see many of them are getting quite creaky in their scale, if you will, um, and and I think that ultimately we will see, pretty much all of first, second, probably even third and fourth wave technology just collapse under its own weight. And if we
Mm.
if we want to have technical systems that actually have futures, we need to do the hard work up front, to something that even once a billion people are using it, it still works the way it's supposed to work.
Yes, and you're very much a visionary, obviously, in this idea of rethinking basically market design. Um, can you reflect on perhaps some of the economics crisis that we've been facing? I'm thinking about, obviously, very famously in '08, but obviously even during COVID. I mean, it was quite a catastrophe for many people, not only in the U.S. but around the world. When you're thinking about those crises and how they shape your visions for more ethical and stable systems. Can you reflect on that a little bit and tell us more about how that shaped the vision itself?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the market's not a magic trick, right? It's a system that has a certain set of components that have to be there, but then it's people using those components that create all the value and all the outcome. And those
Mm-hmm.
people have self-interests. There's essentially several different roles that, in the case of the existing markets, have evolved into position. And the difficulty that we're encountering, to my mind, is that computers impact these roles in very, very different ways. So the markets have always been largely dominated by what are sometimes pejoratively known as middlemen, or other sorts of broker traders, who are providing most of the liquidity. And it must be said, larger amounts of aggregated expertise than any other player in the game. This was true, 600 years ago in Italy and Amsterdam. This is true 6 minutes ago. But the interests of those market participants is making money. They want to find counterparties that are willing to accept very, very bad deals and then offer those very, very bad deals to those counterparties and then take their money from them. That's what they want to do. Uh, and the market structure historically meant that because they were all packed into one room with each other, and everybody got to effectively see all the deals that were on the table, the people willing to accept bad deals would nonetheless get the very best of the bad deals that anybody was willing to offer. And those deals would be pretty good on average.
Mm-hmm.
But that works in a human environment where the information's all being produced by humans, the humans that are all the people in the room. And the deal ratio between sort of broker to broker trades to sort of user to broker trades was sort of in the high single digits, 7, 8 to 1. Flip over to computers. Machines are what's effectively in the room now. Even if you're talking about London Metal Exchange and an actual collegial circle of people, that collegial circle of people is all taking their marching orders from Skynet, essentially. So what we have is a situation where the ratios are much higher. It's 40 to 50 to 1 of trades are sort of, internal to internal versus external to internal. But even more than that, the shouting that used to exist has been replaced by a cacophony of computer signals, and those computer signals are way more than 10 to 1 or 100 to 1 or even 1,000 to 1. The CME group develops terabytes of information every day. You can't absorb that. So the sea of bad and good deals is simply overwhelming to anybody that doesn't have extensive and sophisticated computer support. And if you grow things out of the ground or mine stuff or even run a factory, you can't afford that kind of support to use the marketplace. And so you're just losing day by day by day. And those people that are looking for counterparties willing to take bad deals, under what circumstances are counterparties willing to take bad deals? Well, when they're irrational, when either panic or complacency is set in to the point where they're either willing to sell for way too little or buy for way too much. And so we should expect that with the introduction of computers, markets would become much more bubbly, much more crash-ridden, and much more dangerous. And because circumstances of the outside world also affect that as well, we should expect that the institutions that are operated and funded by the people with all of the money, which is all of the institutions, would also be much more prone to being operated in ways that causes crises to happen, because that's exactly what makes people money in marketplaces. And indeed, since the 80s and the computerization of our marketplaces, with the potentially sole exception of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that is in fact what we've seen. And even there, the aftermath of the Soviet Union was conducted in a manner that was extraordinarily chaotic, giving rise to sort of the new Soviet dictator. So yeah, I think we're looking at a lot of things that are a very natural consequence of people simply wanting to make their nut and get to the end of the day. But this system, which was tolerable and indeed even valuable for centuries when nobody had access to so much as a pocket calculator, is now becoming sort of off balance, out of kilter, and just falling apart.
Yes, and basically the way you solve this, or at least try to patent this understanding of a coordinated discovery market, and I was looking at the deck, by the way, where you illustrate a very interesting example with the farmers, obviously, which want to sell weeds. the baker which want to buy wheat, perhaps to make bakeries. But then you talk about this class, which you just discussed a little bit about with the middleman that you call the informed speculator, which obviously is so objective, is first of all to pay the seller the least amount of money, but then also charge the buyers the most amount of money possible because he pockets the difference basically. And you envision this groundbreaking model to basically propose fairness and maybe even solve this issue. Can you tell us more about how that the basically market unfold and just how special this can be?
Yeah, sure. So the existing market is based on this idea that a deal involves a buyer who's a person with money and information, and a seller who is a person with goods or services or whatever, but the commodity and information coming together, um, effectively negotiating a mutual understanding and writing up a contract that has some amount of money, some amount of commodity, and some price that is going to be the transaction value, and then that contract is executed. And so the existing market says, okay, well, let's say we just tear that contract in half, and we let potential buyers write down an amount and how much they want to buy at their amount, and potential sellers write down an amount and how much they want to sell at an amount, and just kind of build a couple of card decks out of these half contracts and sort these decks out and take a look at the top of each deck. And if the tops of the decks could be kind of combined into a functioning contract, if the numbers are the same, then we just sew that contract together and put it out on the wire, and it's done. Like, it's already been signed. It's like those two guys just made this deal. Congratulations. Well, what jumps out to people who will have programmed computers is that there's a lot of redundancy there, because the buyer had to have information and the seller also had to have information. So what if we rip this contract into three pieces? What if we have a information piece, a currency piece, and a production commodity piece? Well, in this case, we can have a scenario where everybody can come together to negotiate what the price is going to look like for a day or an hour or a week, depending on how hard this stuff is to move around and how often it needs to be moved around. And then we can take those prices and say, hey, everybody's agreed that this is the price that people probably want to sell at. How much were they right? Who wants to buy stuff at this price? Who wants to sell stuff at this price? So then it's like a grocery store. Your grocery store keeps its shelves full pretty decently most of the time, and it doesn't have some complex mechanism of price fluttering going on around all the time. It's just they watch what happens. If they put canned peaches up there and they all empty out, then when they get the next truckload of canned peaches, they know that they need to charge an extra nickel this time, so that people don't buy them all before they get their shipments in. If they put eggs up there and none of them sell, they know they gotta shave a dime off or something so that they can actually sell eggs, and that's pretty much how it works. Instead of just negotiating one price, the negotiators are negotiating the sequence of future prices. So they're going to negotiate tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and they're doing it all simultaneously. And so as trade happens, that informs how speculation can occur, which will inform the trade that happens, and you get this back and forth co-stabilizing effect where it's in everybody's interest to create a better functioning marketplace.
Right, and so basically, in many ways, they become forecasters, right? The informed speculators.
Yeah. One of the tricks of creating something that's new is the vocabulary isn't really that great. So
Sure.
forecasters, another word I use is negotiators. Informed speculators is the word that is currently used in the existing markets to describe the speculators. And the difference in existing markets between an informed speculator and an uninformed speculator is whether or not you make money doing it.
Yes, you're right. Because in many ways, basically now the informed speculators are performing their duty and their profits solely based on the fact that they know obviously who is selling this good as the lowest price. They purchase it as the lowest price, and then have some type of an understanding of who is willing to pay the most amount of money. And that way, that's how they basically pocket the biggest difference. But in your model, basically the sellers will be able to sell more for more money because of basically not having this informed speculator as the middleman that needs to take his portion. But then most importantly, I think the buyers will be able to buy more for less money, and therefore forecasters or negotiators make a higher returns if they were able to correctly predict what those variables, right?
Yeah. So the way my prediction market functions is it works much like a parimutuel system, except instead of like the horse track or a poker pot where there's a rake, in this case the rake is coming in. So you're going to get a piece of the other speculative positions, including your own. But what you're also going to get is a piece of the commissions from the trades that happened. So whereas right now, I was talking about how everything's individualized. So these middlemen are basically looking for the person who will take the worst possible deal and trying to get to that
Mm-hmm.
person before anybody else does to get that very bad deal. Well, there's not a lot of people who will take the worst possible deal, and there's a lot of competition to get to those people. And so that limits sort of the amount of badness that there can be, and the amount of profit that any one person can absorb. Uh, what this does is it gives them essentially a stripe across the entire marketplace. So instead of just getting $10,000 out of this one farmer in central Iowa, you would get a couple bucks maybe, but from every one of the millions of farmers around the world. And so that turns into a much, much larger return because it's being striped across so many more people.
Sure. I assume, as this is so disruptive compared to the traditional model, that you should be facing quite a bit of reluctance, right? Promoting CDM. What are some of those?
Well, my favorite one of all time, it was still the first one I ever encountered. It's a person I went to school with. Actually, he went to McGill. You'd mentioned it was your alma mater.
Interesting.
He worked as a specialist in corn, so he was one of the guys on the floor before they turned them all into computers. And he spent a couple hours having lunch with me trying to insert a logical wedge somewhere and break it apart. And he was completely incapable of doing this. And his parting words were, "I'm sure it won't work, but I don't know why it won't work." There's a lot of attachment to the status quo, even when there's no reason to be attached to the status quo. And indeed, in terms of pushback, there's also whatever's going on at the patent office, where they just blankly refuse to move forward in spite of the law, common sense, technical reason, and precedent.
So, what are some when you've been promoting this for obviously quite a while? From my understanding, you've been obviously kind of like funding this company with some type of urgency to find a way forward since 2013. What are some of the strategies you found to overcome some of those objections?
Well, I call my basic strategy energetic serendipity. I need help, obviously, and so who can help me? Well, I don't know who that is.
Hmm.
And so I put myself out there and make connections and take those connections and make new connections. I learn how to explain these things in colloquial English, which is something I wasn't that great at right out the bat. I did a lot of reading the first few years in economics and gained a lot more sort of knowledge about the existing market structures as a result of that. And so, I picked up the lingo, picked up connections, and I just keep that going. And that has resulted in 4 different projects around the world that are trying to get off the ground incorporating the technology. But, I'm always on the lookout for new ones. And the patent, if I can manage to get it granted, opens a whole new class of doors to go through, because intellectual property doesn't legally exist in the sense that would be necessary without the patent. So that's the other big thing I've been doing with my time.
Sure. What are those 4 projects, by the way, that are already kind of like in a come up?
In order of their sort of attempted inception, there's a blockchain-inspired DAO that's trying to operate in Singapore that wants
Okay.
to use coordinated discovery technology for managing certain parts of its market behavior. There's a coal index in South Africa. There's a coffee index in East Africa. And the most recent of them is also a blockchain inspired thing that is still kind of, operating in submarine mode. So I'm in NDA. I can't really talk much more about that except to say that it's coming out of Sweden.
Interesting. And you mentioned blockchain, so that's a perfect, perhaps overlapping with my next topic and train of thoughts. You done this very interesting newsletter now that I saw on LinkedIn called the Fourth Age, and kind of like what you call the AI revolution with Marty Wiener, which perhaps is a buddy of yours. When you're thinking about the intersections of artificial intelligence and game theory and and everything that basically you've been encountering in your work, how do you think that will shape the next generation of global trade systems?
So the fourth age is this idea I've been kicking around in my head for a while. And I divide sort of human existence by the imposition of certain inventions that fundamentally alter our relationship with reality. And to me, those inventions are the plow, the Watt steam engine, and the computer. And the change of interaction are fundamentally changing the productivity of land, which is what the plow did, fundamentally altering the efficiency that physical work could be produced, which is what the Watt steam engine is the first developed heat engine on Earth that is more efficient than a human body.
Interesting.
And what the computer does is it does the same thing the Watt steam engine does for physical labor, but for control systems. So again, the most efficient control system on Earth up until 1950-ish was a human brain. And since then, it has been possible in a vastly increasing number of applications to come up with more efficient techniques. And we can see this in some very horrifying applications. In World War II, the kamikazes were incredibly effective, and in 1991, the guided missile strikes in Desert Storm were incredibly effective. They were both incredibly effective for the same reason. Guided munitions are incredibly more effective than unguided munitions, but the kamikazes guided their munitions by putting a human brain inside the bomb.
Right.
And having that human brain do the guidance, whereas in Desert Storm, we can use a microchip or multiple microchips. And we can see the same kinds of things occur in much more productive applications, like manufacturing, which has become extraordinarily automated. And that's led to when I was a kid, cars would advertise that they had 40 or 50,000 mile warranties, and these days that's chump change. Like, of course, your car drives 150,000 miles. What are we selling here? Uh, so, so those sorts of this sort of progress to me is important because of its implications, not in warfare or manufacturing, which have already been extraordinary, but because it also changes our social, political, and economic relationships with each other. Because, as we're now seeing with generative AI, large amounts of communication is the result of machines. And in societies that have developed to determine policy and ethics based on humans having discussions with other humans, if most of the discussion elements aren't human beings anymore, what kind of ethics or policies might those societies? Well, we don't have to wonder about how horrifying that can get. We can just read the paper if we can still read, which many of us can't anymore because machines are happy to read things out loud to us now.
When you're thinking about a fair bit of what you're doing is philosophy, modern philosophy, even if in just your recent comments, this understanding of, again, if it's a machine talking to a machine, how is human ethics, or if does any human ethic basically apply to it? When you're thinking about the role of philosophy in basically technology and economics, how do you see that? How do you see that shaped out? What can be next for a world more and more digitalized, more and more automated, and perhaps less and less human interaction heavy?
I think there's been a massive failure of our sort of purpose-centric organs of society. Philosophers, theologians, priests, uh, throughout human history, these people have been the the purveyors of and guides to meaning. And one of the things that happened in the 20th century is that we discovered that logic doesn't work the way that everybody thought it did. And incomputability is one of the pieces of that discovery. Uh, so we're living in the Enlightenment, or we were, I would argue. I'd say that ended more than a century ago. Uh, And the Enlightenment is largely founded on the notion that reason is sufficient, that things like the Christian ethics that were shown by Aquinas to be compatible with Aristotelian logic, in fact, could be derived from these deeper and higher reasons that, that the people of the day came up with. And of course, some of the more stodgy, ones said, well, you can't derive the ought from the is, and that you can't really do that. But those sorts of arguments that it would be good and sufficient, we did not need to have divine right of kings, because we could have rational discussions, and those rational discussions could come up with moral outcomes. But logic is not nearly as omnipotent as they felt it to be, nor nearly as omniscient as they felt it to be. And we know that for certain because the logic that proved that was true is the logic that tells us how to build the computers that you and I are talking to each other on right now. And math has done a lot of work on itself in the last 100 years to reestablish things like Gödel's incompleteness theorem were a real kick in the butt for mathematics, which was riding high on this concept that they were all powerful and were going to eventually figure out the last few little problems and just solve everything. To learn that your very foundational assumptions about even foundational assumptions were ludicrously wrong, has led to an enormous amount of work to reestablish the foundations of things like arithmetic, because arithmetic obviously works. There must be some reasonable way to explain that it works, but you have to do a lot of work to find that reasonable way, and we've done that. Physics has done some of that work, but not nearly enough. And the other sciences, and in particular the social sciences, haven't done it at all. And so far as I can tell, philosophy and theology have absolutely abandoned the concept of even attempting to do that kind of work. And without it, I I fear for what a meaningless culture will bring. I think that's what we're looking at. So I think again, just as we need to have made these kinds of decisions up front because the machines can cycle effectively infinitely fast compared to us. And so if we don't build it in at the foundations, we're not going to be able to tack it on after this thing's blown up to the entire world. Uh, uh, all of our institutions will need to be rethought from below the ground up, in order to not just be ground under by the capacities of this, what is currently a noise machine that appears to be killing us. There's strong correlations between like social media and teen suicide, and there are no countries capable of producing modern technology with even replacement level birth rates. Uh, these are obviously not problems for this instant. If we don't solve it by Tuesday, it's not over.
Right.
But clearly, there's a trajectory involved here, and it's a problem that needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved on the terms of the machines. It needs to be resolved for us because we're what we care about. But uh, cars have brakes and bumpers and a steering wheel that has power steering assist and so on, so that we can use them effectively. But they also, the machine's designed to operate the way it operates. If we left that part out and didn't put the oil in and the secured housing and stuff like that, then the car would just sort of be a bomb, or would throw a rod through the glove compartment or something. Like, if you don't design the machine to work as a machine, then it will break in ways that are unpredictable and dangerous. So you have to solve both problems at the same time. And currently, we regard politics, sociology, theology, philosophy as, again, sort of purely human and isolated activities. And we don't, those people don't want to have to subject themselves to the discipline of having to think about computational mathematics.
In many ways, would you say that our performance before everything technology driven world is creating one of the most meaningless society and civilization we ever seen?
Yeah, I'd say that's completely fair. Uh, the philosophies that presently exist do not hold up to computational mathematical scrutiny. And when you reread Enlightenment philosophers with this knowledge, even the best of them become quite silly, because we just sort of know, as a matter of mathematics, they have this sort of confidence for the future, that the kinds of problems that they haven't quite worked out yet will soon get worked out. We know that those problems were disproved as impossible. So we know that it's not going to work.
Yeah, when you're thinking about the world ahead of us, as we're not stopping technology, obviously, and you know this better than pretty much anyone. In your understanding of what ought to be done, so we can gear this world to perhaps really become meaningful or to guide it towards a meaningful path, can you share some insights about what you think is necessary to do so?
Well, the work basically. We need to identify Chesterton's fences, see what's around, and figure out why it's there for real. What the true meaning of all of our various institutions are, and look at what effect having computers has on those things, and see whether or not it's positive or negative. And so at the very basis, we need to do this for our ethics itself. I'm kind of cheating. I'm doing the simplest problem. I'm just working on economics. So, richer is better than poorer, basically. Uh,
Hmm.
but people who are presuming to speak for meaning and society and ethics, they got to do the work. They got to look at what infinite recursion does to their ideas, because what it does to most of their ideas is, reveal them as pathetic nonsense.
In the instance in which we have this conclusion where the work is so negatively impacting the ethics of our world and what we stands for, do you believe in such conclusion? I see this quite often nowadays. Do you believe in such conclusion where we ought to completely stop it because it's that dangerous to the meaningfulness of human existence in the first place?
I am quite confident that life is fully compatible with computational technology,
Sure.
because one of the few objects in the universe that is a nearly perfect representation of Alan Turing's model of the Turing machine, general computation, is DNA, RNA, Golgi bodies. So the way life on our planet actually works is Turing machines, very, very closely. So if life was incompatible with computational technology, um, you know, our 3.8 billion years of fossil record suggests that we're on a very lucky tear, if that's true.
Hmm.
um, I think it's incredibly likely that it's compatible, and I think that just as some argue that some of the older Bible stories are essentially tales
Hmm.
about the
Metaphors.
divide between hunter-gatherer and uh, agricultural civilization, that things like the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain, being agricultural, kills Abel, the pastoralist, um,
Mm.
is a reflection of that part, and how indeed in our very, very historical period, industrial society is the standard on earth today, because non-industrial society cannot stand before industrial society. It's just not possible for agriculturalists or pre-agriculturalists to put together the the men and materials to be able to wage war against an industrial society. I think that in information society, if we do the work and if we find solutions, temporary though they may be, as stepping stones to whatever next better solutions they are, that we would experience radically better societies. So again, if you look at history for essentially the entire historical period, uh, productivity is pretty flat. There's some bumps and dips, large scale peaceful empires like Rome or a few of the Chinese dynasties or some of the Bronze Age stuff like Middle Kingdom, Egypt, and so on, we're able to get more out of land because it's easier to farm when people haven't murdered you. But that aside, everything was pretty flat. And then Watt shows up and says, hey, instead of hiring some poor, ignorant human being and, chaining him to a pump in a mine or something, what if we just burned wood or coal, which is what we're getting out of the mine anyway, and just had it do the work for us? And suddenly life started to get exponentially better. And that
Mm-hmm.
exponential improvement is the hallmark of the industrial age. But exponential improvement isn't really the way that it works in sort of control and thought space. We can come up with incredibly better systems. I've developed numerous systems that were 1000x or even million x better than the alternatives that existed. CDM uh, uh, probably reduces bandwidth requirements of the markets by a factor of around 10 million, for example. Um, so the kinds of growth that are possible in a computational space dwarf our present conceptions. And so just as the kinds of controls that you would need to have to corral small dogs and large wolves would be very, very different kinds of controls. Our societies will need to develop the sorts of controls that can cope with things that can operate at global scale within a few seconds, which is not something we've ever had to face before. And, it's a hard problem, but as we find the solutions to those problems, suddenly, instead of somebody like me facing a decade plus struggle to explain how to make the world a vastly wealthier place, what if the next person that comes up with an idea that doubles human wealth can essentially just tweet it and go on about their lives?
Right, and in your fight for this patent with the government, I love your tagline, which is building a better economy for a wealthier world, and I think that summarize your I suppose the idea and the actions in which you're doing and perhaps pushing forwards when you're thinking about your vision of the long term, basically understanding of we understood basically what a more equitable and efficient global economy is from this conversation. But where do you think that lands us, and where do your mind is going when you're thinking about, hey, in 50 years from now, or as long term as your mind can imagine it, what do you think will be essential and perhaps the main components of this equitable and efficient market?
Well, I think we've moved our incentives away from productivity and uh, towards rent seeking. And so, if our markets effectively wipe out the rent seeking potential and move that potential to the productive, then becoming more productive becomes the way to get rich. And so all the people that are presently engaged in rent seeking, some of them are actually bad actors who want to get rich but are only willing to do so by harming others, and
Mm-hmm.
they're going to have to find some new form of perfidy. But for the people that are ambitious, intelligent, young people looking at the world and saying, what do people do that want to turn their lives into successes? They're going to say, oh, well, they go into manufacturing, or they go into planting or they go into mining, and they figure out how to make those things work better. Because when you make those things work better, you make a lot more money. Or you just do it. You figure out how to keep doing it. You take over from somebody that's, done their 30 and it's time to retire because it's, the joints are starting to wear a little bit, and you pick up that mantle and you start pushing. So I think that very much moves things forward. I think that there are other technological advances in manufacture around things like 3D printing and so on, that can advance in ways that would make commodity consumption even more valuable. And so we could reach a point where the economy was more robust and more diffuse at the same time, where people would actually have their own economic plant, as it were, and would still be involved in regional, continent scale or even global scale exchange, but not so much tied to what in some cases are called bullshit jobs, where you're kind of doing something that's mindless or it seems to be pointless in order to gain access to the economy so that you can keep going to the grocery store. Like that to me, a lot of people seem to be kind of trapped in a world like that, because the only alternative is to win one of these winner-take-all type scenarios, where suddenly you become a master of the universe and you're stealing billions from millions.
Fascinating. And I love what Benjamin Franklin had to say on this, which is an investment in knowledge pays the best interests. Mr. Noah Healy, it's been an absolute pleasure to go very, very extensively into these topics and some of the most interesting thing that you're working on. Would you like to share any last word with our audience, please?
Yeah, this was a lot of fun talking to you too, actually. I'm happy to get into it. For those in the audience that would like to learn more about what I'm up to, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm Noah Healy there. There's a website, Coordisc.com, Coordisc. And like I said, I'm currently suing the federal government 24-2311 in the federal circuit. You can find it online and sort of see what I'm up to.
Thank you for spending your time with us today on the Meaningful Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review or share it with someone who could benefit from it. And always remember, your story matters. Make it meaningful. We hope to see you next time.